Part 3. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. Hide me from me. Fill these holes with eyes, for mine are not mine. Hide me head and need, for I am no good, so dead in life, so much time. Be wing and shade my me from my desire to be hooked fish. That worm wine looks sweet and makes my me blind, and to my heart hide, for I shall at this rate it also eat in time. Stan Rice, Cannibals, Some Lamb, 1975. Lestat, in the arms of the goddess. I can't say when I awoke, when I first came to my senses. I remember knowing that she and I had been together for a long time, that I'd been feasting on her blood with an animal abandon, that Enkil was destroyed and she alone held the primeval power, and that she was causing me to see things and understand things that made me cry like a child. 200 years ago, when I drank from her in the shrine, the blood had been silent, eerily and magnificently silent. Now it was an utter transport of images ravishing the brain, just as the blood itself ravished the body. I was learning everything that had happened. I was there as the others died, one by one, in that horrible way. And then there were the voices that rose and fell seemingly without purpose, like a whispering choir in a cave. It seemed there was a lucid moment in which I connected everything, the rock concert, the house in Carmel Valley, her radiant face before me, and the knowledge that I was here now with her in this dark, snowy place. I'd waked her, or rather I had given her the reason to rise as she had said it, the reason to turn and stare back at the throne on which she'd sat and take those first faltering steps away from it. Do you know what it meant to lift my hand and see it move in the light? Do you know what it meant to hear the sudden sound of my own voice echoing in that marble chamber? Surely we had danced together in the dark, snow-covered wood, or was it only that we had embraced over and over again? Terrible things had happened over the whole world, terrible things. The execution of those who should never have been born, evil spawn. The massacre at the concert had been only the finish. Yet I was in her arms in this chilling darkness, in the familiar scent of winter, and her blood was mine again. And it was enslaving me when she drew away. I felt agony. I had to clear my thoughts, had to know whether or not Marius was alive, whether or not Louis and Gabrielle and Armand had been spared. I had to find myself again somehow. But the voices, the rising tide of voices, mortals near and far, distance made no difference, intensity was the measure. It was a million times my old hearing when I could pause on a city street and hear the tenants of some dark building, each in his own chamber, talking, thinking, praying for as long and as closely as I liked. Sudden silence when she spoke. Gabrielle and Louis are safe, I've told you this. Do you think I would hurt those you love? Look into my eyes now and listen only to what I say. I have spared many more than are required, and this I did for you as well as for myself, that I may see myself reflected in immortal eyes, and hear the voices of my children speaking to me. But I chose the ones you love, the ones you would see again. I could not take that comfort from you, but now you are with me, and you must see and know what is being revealed to you. You must have courage to match mine. I couldn't endure it, the visions she was giving me, that horrid little baby Jenks in those last moments. Had it been a desperate dream, the moment of her death? A string of images flickering within her dying brain? I couldn't bear it, and Laurent, my old companion Laurent, drying up in the flames on the pavement, and on the other side of the world, Felix, whom I had known also at the theater of the vampires, driven, burning, through the alleyways of Naples and finally into the sea, and the others, so many others the world over. I wept for them. I wept for all of it. Suffering without meaning, a life like that, I said of baby Jenks crying. That's why I showed you all of it, she answered. That's why it is finished. The children of darkness are no more, and we shall have only angels now. But the others, I asked, what has happened to Armand? And the voices were starting again, the low humming that could mount to a deafening roar. Come now, my prince, she whispered. Silence again. She reached up and held my face in her hands. Her black eyes grew larger, the white face suddenly supple and almost soft. If you must see it, I'll show you those who still live, those whose names will become legend along with yours and mine. Legend? She turned her head ever so slightly. It seemed a miracle when she closed her eyes, because then the visible life went out of her altogether. A dead and perfect thing, fine black eyelashes curling exquisitely. I looked down at her throat at the pale blue of the artery beneath the flesh, suddenly visible as if she meant for me to see it. The lust I felt was unsupportable. The goddess mine, I took her roughly with a strength that would have hurt a mortal woman. The icy skin seemed absolutely impenetrable, and then my teeth broke through it and the hot fount was roaring into me again. The voices came, yet they died back at my command, and there was nothing then but the low rush of the blood in her heart beating slowly next to my own. Darkness, a brick cellar, a coffin made of oak and polished to a fine luster, locks of gold, the magic moment. The locks opened as if sprung by an invisible key. The lid rose, revealing the satin lining. There was a faint scent of Eastern perfume. I saw Armand lying on the white satin pillow, a seraph with long, full auburn hair, head to one side, eyes blank as if to wake was unfailingly startling. I watched him rise from the coffin with slow, elegant gestures. Our gestures, for we are the only beings who routinely rise from coffins. I saw him close the lid across the damp brick floor. He walked to yet another coffin, and this one he opened reverently, as if it were a casket containing a rare prize. Inside, a young man lay sleeping, lifeless yet dreaming. Dreaming of a jungle where a red-haired woman walked, a woman I could not clearly see. And then the most bizarre scene, something I'd glimpsed before, but where? 2 women kneeling beside an altar, that is. I thought it was an altar. A tensing in her, a tightening. She shifted against me like a statue of the Virgin ready to crush me. I swooned. I thought I heard her speak a name, but the blood came in another gush, and my body was throbbing again with the pleasure. No earth, no gravity. The brick cellar once more. A shadow had fallen over the young man's body. Another had come into the cellar and placed a hand on Armand's shoulder. Armand knew him. Mael was his name. Come. But where is he taking them? Purple evening in the redwood forest, Gabrielle was walking in that careless, straight-backed, unstoppable way of hers, her eyes like 2 chips of glass, giving back nothing to what she saw around her. And there was Louis beside her, struggling gracefully to keep up. Louis looked so touchingly civilized in the wilderness, so hopelessly out of place. The vampire guise of last night had been discarded, yet he seemed even more the gentleman in his worn old clothing, merely a little down on his luck. Out of his league with her, and does she know it? Will she take care of him? But they're both afraid for me. The tiny sky above was turning to polished porcelain. The trees seemed to bring the light down their massive trunks almost to the roots. I could hear a creek rushing in the shadows. Then I saw it. Gabrielle walked right into the water in her brown boots. But where are they going? And who was the third one with them, who came into view only as Gabrielle turned back to look at him? My God, such a face, and so placid, ancient, powerful, yet letting the 2 young ones walk before him. Through the trees I could see a clearing, a house. On a high stone veranda stood a red-haired woman, the woman whom I'd seen in the jungle, ancient, expressionless mask of a face, like the face of the male in the forest who was looking up at her. Face, like the face of my queen. Let them come together. I sighed as the blood poured into me. It will make it all the simpler. But who were they, these ancient ones, these creatures with countenances washed as clean as her own? The vision shifted. This time the voices were a soft wreath around us, whispering, crying. And for one moment, I wanted to listen, to try to detach from the monstrous chorus. One fleeting mortal song, imagine it. Voices from all over, from the mountains of India, from the streets of Alexandria, from the tiny hamlets near and far. But another vision was coming. Marius was climbing up out of a blood-stained pit of broken ice with Pandora and Santino to aid him. They had just managed to reach the jagged shelf of a basement floor. The dried blood was a crust covering half of Marius's face. He looked angry, bitter, eyes dull, his long yellow hair matted with blood. With a limp he went up a spiraling iron stairs, Pandora and Santino in his wake. It was like a pipe through which they ascended. When Pandora tried to help him, he brushed her aside roughly. Wind, bitter cold. Marius's house lay open to the elements as if an earthquake had broken it apart. Sheets of glass were shattered into dangerous fragments. Rare and beautiful tropical fish were frozen on the sand floor of a great ruined tank. Snow blanketed the furnishings and lay heaped against the bookshelves, against the statues, against the racks of records and tapes. The birds were dead in their cages, the green plants were dripping with icicles. Marius stared at the dead fish in the murky margin of ice in the bottom of the tank. He stared at the great dead stalks of seaweed that lay among the shards of gleaming glass. Even as I watched, I saw him healing. The bruises seemed to melt from his face. I saw the face itself regain its natural shape. His leg was mending. He could stand almost straight. In rage, he stared at the tiny blue and silver fish. He looked up at the sky, at the white wind that obliterated the stars completely. He brushed the flakes of dried blood from his face and hair. Thousands of pages had been scattered about by the wind, pages of parchment, old crumbling paper. The swirling snow came down now lightly into the ruined parlor. There Marius took up the brass poker for a walking stick and stared out through the ruptured wall at the starving wolves howling in their pen. No food for them since he, their master, had been buried. Ah, the sound of the wolves howling. I heard Santino speak to Marius, try to tell him that they must go, they were expected, that a woman waited for them in the redwood forest, a woman as old as the mother. And the meeting could not begin until they had come. A chord of alarm went through me. What was this meeting? Marius understood, but he didn't answer. He was listening to the wolves. To the wolves. The snow and the wolves. I dreamed of wolves. I felt myself drift away, back into my own mind, into my own dreams and memories. I saw a pack of fleet wolves racing over the newly fallen snow. I saw myself as a young man fighting them, a pack of wolves that had come in deep winter to prey upon my father's village 200 years ago. I saw myself, the mortal man, so close to death that I could smell it, but I had cut down the wolves one by one. Ah, such coarse youthful vigor, the pure luxury of thoughtless, irresistible life. Or so it seemed. At the time it had been misery, hadn't it? The frozen valley, my horse and dog slain, but now all I could do was remember. And to see the snow covering the mountains, my father's land. I opened my eyes. She had let me go and forced me back a pace. For the first time I understood where we really were. Not in some abstract night, but in a real place, in a place that had once, for all purposes, been mine. Yes, she whispered, look around you. I knew it by the air, by the smell of winter, and as my vision cleared again, I saw the broken battlements high above, and the tower. This is my father's house, I whispered. This is the castle in which I was born. Stillness, the snow shining white over the old floor. This had been the great hall where we now stood. God, to see it in ruins, to know that it had been desolate for so long. Soft as earth the old stones seemed, and here had been the table, the great long table fashioned in the time of the Crusades. And there had been the gaping hearth, and there the front door. The snow was not falling now. I looked up and I saw the stars. The tower had its round shape still, soaring hundreds of feet above the broken roof, though all the rest was a fractured shell, my father's house. Lightly she stepped away from me, across the shimmering whiteness of the floor, turning slowly in a circle, her head back as if she were dancing. To move, to touch solid things, to pass from the realm of dreams into the real world. Of all these joys she'd spoken earlier, it took my breath away watching her. Her garments were timeless, a black silk cloak, a gown of silken folds that swirled gently about her narrow form. Since the dawn of history, women have worn such garments, and they wear them now, into the ballrooms of the world. I wanted to hold her again, but she forbade it with a soft, sudden gesture. What had she said? Can you imagine it? When I realized that he could no longer keep me there, that he was standing before the throne, and he had not stirred, that not the faintest response came from him. She turned, she smiled. The pale light of the sky struck the lovely angles of her face, the high cheekbones, the gentle slope of her chin. Alive she looked, utterly alive. Then she vanished. Akasha! Come to me, she said. But where was she? Then I saw her far, far away from me at the very end of the hall. A tiny figure at the entrance to the tower. I could scarce make out the features of her face now, yet I could see behind her the black rectangle of the open door. I started to walk towards her. No, she said. Time to use the strength I've given you. Merely come. I didn't move. My mind was clear. My vision was clear. And I knew what she meant. But I was afraid. I'd always been the sprinter, the leaper, the player of tricks, preternatural speed that baffled mortals. That was not new to me. But she asked for a different accomplishment. I was to leave the spot where I stood and locate myself suddenly beside her, with a speed which I myself could not track. It required a surrender to try such a thing. Yes, surrender, she said gently. Come. For a tense moment I merely looked at her, her white hand gleaming on the edge of the broken door. Then I made the decision to be standing at her side. It was as if a hurricane touched me, full of noise and random force. Then I was there. I felt myself shudder all over. The flesh of my face hurt a little. But what did that matter? I looked down into her eyes and I smiled. Beautiful she was, so beautiful, the goddess with her long black plaited hair. Impulsively I took her in my arms and kissed her cold lips and felt them yield to me just a little. Then the blasphemy of it struck me. It was like the time I'd kissed her in the shrine. I wanted to say something in apology, but I was staring at her throat again, hungry for the blood. It tantalized me that I could drink it, and yet she was who she was. She could have destroyed me in a second with no more than the wish to see me die. That's what she had done to the others. The danger thrilled me darkly. I closed my fingers round her arms, felt the flesh give ever so slightly. I kissed her again and again. I could taste blood in it. She drew back and placed her finger on my lips. Then she took my hand and led me through the tower door. Starlight fell through the broken roof hundreds of feet above us, through a gaping hole in the floor of the highest room. "Do you see?" she said. "The room at the very top is still there. The stairs are gone. The room is unreachable, except for you and me, my prince." Slowly she started to rise, never taking her eyes off me. She traveled upwards, the sheer silk of her gown billowing only slightly. I watched in astonishment as she rose higher and higher, her cloak ruffled as if by a faint breeze. She passed through the opening and then stood on the very edge. Hundreds of feet, not possible for me to do this. "Come to me, my prince," she said, her voice soft, carrying in the emptiness. "Do as you have already done, do it quickly, and as mortals so often say, don't look down." Whispered laughter. "Suppose I got a fifth of the way up, a good leap, the height, say, of a 4-story building. Which was rather easy for me, but also the limit of dizziness, not possible. Disorientation? How had we come to be here? It was all spinning again. I saw her, but it was dreamlike, and the voices were intruding. I didn't want to lose this moment. I wanted to remain connected with time in a series of linked moments, to understand this on my terms. "Lestat," she whispered, "now." Such a tender thing, her small gesture to me, to be quick. I did what I had done before. I looked at her and decided that I should instantly be at her side. The hurricane again, the air bruising me, I threw up my arms and fought the resistance. I think I saw the hole in the broken boards as I passed through it. Then I was standing there, shaken, terrified I would fall. It sounded as if I were laughing, but I think I was just going mad a little, crying actually. "But how?" I said. "I have to know how I did it." "You know the answer," she said. "The intangible thing which animates you has much more strength now than it did before. It moved you as it has always moved you. Whether you take a step or take flight, it is simply a matter of degree." "I want to try it again," I said. She laughed very softly but spontaneously. "Look about this room," she said. "Do you remember it?" I nodded. "When I was a young man, I came here all the time," I said. I moved away from her. I saw piles of ruined furniture, the heavy benches and stools that had once filled our castle. Medieval work so crude and strong it was damn near indestructible, like the trees that fall in the forest and remain for centuries, the bridges over streams, their trunks covered with moss. So these things had not rotted away. Even old caskets remained. And armor. Oh yes, the old armor, ghosts of past glory, and in the dust I saw a faint bit of color, tapestries, but they were utterly destroyed. In the revolution, these things must have been brought here for safekeeping, and then the stairs had fallen away. I went to one of the tiny narrow windows, and I looked out on the land, far below, nestled in the mountainside, were the electric lights of a little city, sparse, yet there. A car made its way down the narrow road. Ah, the modern world. So close, yet far away. The castle was the ghost of itself. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked her. "It's so painful to see this. As painful as everything else. Look there. At the suits of armor," she said. "At what lies at their feet. You remember the weapons you took with you the day you went out to kill the wolves?" "Yes, I remember them." "Look at them again. I will give you new weapons, infinitely more powerful weapons, with which you will kill for me now." "Kill?" I glanced down at the cache of arms, rusted, ruined it seemed, save for the old broadsword, the fine one which had been my father's and given to him by his father, who had got it from his father, and so forth and so on, back to the time of Saint Louis, the Lord's broadsword which I, the seventh son, had used on that long-ago morning when I'd gone out like a medieval prince to kill the wolves. "But whom will I kill?" I asked. She drew closer. How utterly sweet her face was, how brimming with innocence. Her brows came together. There was that tiny vertical fold of flesh in her forehead, just for an instant, then all went smooth again. "I would have you obey me without question," she said gently, "and then understanding would follow. But this is not your way." "No," I confessed. "I've never been able to obey anyone. Not for very long." "So fearless," she said, smiling. She opened her right hand gracefully, and quite suddenly she was holding the sword. It seemed I'd felt the thing moving towards her, a tiny change of atmosphere, no more. I stared at it, at the jeweled scabbard and the great bronze hilt that was of course a cross. The belt still hung from it, the belt I'd bought for it during some long ago summer, of toughened leather and plated steel. It was a monster of a weapon, as much as for battering as for slashing or piercing. I remembered the weight of it, the way it had made my arm ache when I had slashed again and again at the attacking wolves. Knights in battle had often held such weapons with 2 hands. But then what did I know of such battles? I'd been no knight. I'd skewered an animal with this weapon, my only moment of mortal glory. And what had it got me? The admiration of an accursed bloodsucker who chose to make me his heir. She placed the sword in my hands. "It's not heavy now, my prince," she said. "You are immortal, truly immortal. My blood is in you, and you will use your new weapons for me as you once used this sword." A violent shudder went through me as I touched the sword. It was as if the thing held some latent memory of what it had witnessed. I saw the wolves again. I saw myself standing in the blackened, frozen forest, ready to kill. And I saw myself a year later in Paris, dead, immortal, a monster, and on account of those wolves, wolf killer, the vampire had called me. He had picked me from the common herd because I had slain those cursed wolves and worn their fur so proudly through the winter streets of Paris. How could I feel such bitterness even now? Did I want to be dead and buried down below in the village graveyard? I looked out of the window again at the snow-covered hillside. Wasn't the same thing happening now? Love for what I'd been in those early thoughtless mortal years. Again I asked, "But whom or what will I kill?" No answer. I thought of baby Jenks again, that pitiful little thing, and all the blood drinkers who were now dead, and I had wanted a war with them, a little war, and they were all dead, all who had responded to the battle call dead. I saw the coven house in Istanbul burning. I saw an old one she had caught and burned so slowly, one who had fought her and cursed her. I was crying again. "Yes, I took your audience from you," she said. "I burnt away the arena in which you sought to shine. I stole the battle, but don't you see? I offer you finer things than you have ever reached for. I offer you the world, my prince." "How so?" "Stop the tears you shed for baby Jenks and for yourself. Think on the mortals you should weep for. Envision those who have suffered through the long, dreary centuries, the victims of famine and deprivation and ceaseless violence, victims of endless injustice and endless battling. How then can you weep for a race of monsters who, without guidance or purpose, played the devil's gambit on every mortal they chanced to meet?" "I know, I understand. Do you? Or do you merely retreat from such things to play your symbolic games? Symbol of evil in your rock music. That is nothing, my prince, nothing at all." "Why didn't you kill me along with the rest of them?" I asked, belligerently, miserably. I grasped the hilt of the sword in my right hand. I fancied I could see the dried blood of the wolf still on it. I pulled the blade free of the leather scabbard. Yes, the blood of the wolf. "I'm no better than they are, am I said. "Why spare any of us?" Fear stopped me suddenly, terrible fear for Gabrielle and Louis and Armand, for Marius, even for Pandora and Maëlle. Fear for myself. There isn't a thing made that doesn't fight for life, even when there is no real justification. I wanted to live, I always had. "I would have you love me," she whispered tenderly, such a voice. In a way it was like Armand's voice, a voice that could caress you when it spoke to you, draw you into itself. "And so I take time with you," she continued. She put her hands on my arms and looked up into my eyes. "I want you to understand you are my instrument, and so the others shall be if they are wise. Don't you see? There has been a design to all of it. Your coming, my waking. For now the hopes of the millennia can be realized at last. Look on the little town below and on this ruined castle. This could be Bethlehem, my prince, my savior. And together we shall realize all the world's most enduring dreams." "But how could that possibly be?" I asked. Did she know how afraid I was, that her words moved me from simple fear into terror? Surely she did. "Ah, you are so strong, princeling," she said. "But you were destined for me, surely. Nothing defeats you. You fear, and you don't fear. For a century I watched you suffer, watched you grow weak and finally go down in the earth to sleep, and I then saw you rise, the very image of my own resurrection." She bowed her head now as if she were listening to sounds from far away, the voices rising. I heard them too, perhaps, because she did. I heard the ringing din, and then annoyed, I pushed them away. "So strong," she said. "They cannot drag you down into them, the voices, but do not ignore this power. It's as important as any other you possess. They are praying to you just as they have always prayed to me." I understood her meaning, but I didn't want to hear their prayers. What could I do for them? What had prayers to do with the thing that I was? "For centuries they were my only comfort," she continued. "By the hour, by the week, by the year, I listened. It seemed in early times that the voices I heard had woven a shroud to make of me a dead and buried thing. Then I learned to listen more carefully. I learned to select one voice from the many as if picking a thread from the whole. To that voice alone I would listen, and through it I knew the triumph and ruin of a single soul. I watched her in silence. Then as the years passed, I acquired a greater power, to leave my body invisibly, and to go to the single mortal whose voice I listened to see then, through that mortal's eyes. I would walk in the body of this one or that one. I would walk in sunshine and in darkness. I would suffer, I would hunger, I would know pain. Sometimes I walked in the bodies of immortals, as I walked in the body of baby Jenks. Often I walked with Marius, selfish, vain Marius who confuses greed with respect, who is ever dazzled by the decadent creations of a way of life, as selfish as he is. Oh, don't suffer so. I loved him. I love him now. He cared for me, my keeper. Her voice was bitter, but only for that instant. But more often I walked with one among the poor and the sorrowful. It was the rawness of true life I craved. She stopped. Her eyes clouded. Her brows came together and the tears rose in her eyes. I knew the power of which she spoke, but only slightly. I wanted so to comfort her, but when I reached out to embrace her, she motioned for me to be still. "I would forget who I was, where I was," she continued. "I would be that creature, the one whose voice I had chosen, sometimes for years. Then the horror would return, the realization that I was a motionless, purposeless thing condemned to sit forever in a golden shrine. Can you imagine the horror of waking suddenly to that realization? That all you have seen and heard and been is nothing but illusion? The observation of another's life? I would return to myself. I would become again what you see before you, this idol with a heart and brain." I nodded. Centuries ago, when I had first laid eyes upon her, I had imagined unspeakable suffering locked within her. I had imagined agonies without expression, and I had been right. "I knew he kept you there," I said. I spoke of Enkil who was now gone, destroyed, a fallen idol. I was remembering the moment in the shrine when I drunk from her, and he'd come to claim her and almost finish me then and there. Had he known what he meant to do? Was all reason gone, even then? She only smiled in answer. Her eyes were dancing as she looked out into the dark. The snow had begun again, swirling almost magically, catching the light of the stars and the moon and diffusing it through all the world, it seemed. It was meant. "What happened?" she answered finally. "That I should pass those years growing ever more strong. Growing so strong finally that no one can be my equal." She stopped. Just for a moment her conviction seemed to waver, but then she grew confident again. "He was but an instrument in the end, my poor beloved king, my companion in agony. His mind was gone, yes, and I did not destroy him, not really. I took into myself what was left of him, and at times I had been as empty, as silent, as devoid of the will even to dream as he was. Only for him there was no returning. He had seen his last visions. He was of no use anymore. He has died a god's death because it only made me stronger. And it was all meant, my prince. All meant from start to finish. But how? By whom? Whom?" She smiled again. "Don't you understand? You need look no further for the cause of anything. I am the fulfillment, and I shall from this moment on be the cause. There is nothing and no one now who can stop me." Her face hardened for a second, that wavering again. "Old curses mean nothing. In silence I have attained such power that no force in nature could harm me. Even my first brood cannot harm me, though they plot against me. It was meant that those years should pass before you came. How did I change it?" She came a step closer. She put her arm around me, and it felt soft for the moment, not like the hard thing it truly was. We were just two beings standing near to each other, and she looked indescribably lovely to me, so pure and otherworldly. I felt the awful desire for the blood again, to bend down, to kiss her throat, to have her as I had had 1,000 mortal women, yet she, the goddess, she with the immeasurable power. I felt the desire rising, cresting. Again she put her finger on my lips as if to say, "Be still." "Do you remember when you were a boy here?" she asked. "Think back now on the time when you begged them to send you to the monastery school. Do you remember the things the brothers taught you, the prayers, the hymns, the hours you worked in the library, the hours in the chapel when you prayed alone?" "I remember, of course." I felt the tears coming again. I could see it so vividly, the monastery library and the monks who had taught me and believed I could be a priest. I saw the cold little cell with its bed of boards. I saw the cloister and the garden veiled in rosy shadow. God, I didn't want to think now of those times. But some things can never be forgotten. "Do you remember the morning that you went into the chapel," she continued, "and you knelt on the bare marble floor with your arms out in the form of the cross, and you told God you would do anything, if only he would make you good? Yes, good." Now it was my voice that was tinged with bitterness. "You said you would suffer martyrdom, torments unspeakable. It did not matter, if only you were to be someone who was good." Yes, I remember. I saw the old saints. I heard the hymns that had broken my heart. I remember the morning my brothers had come to take me home, and I had begged them on my knees to let me stay there. And later, when your innocence was gone and you took the high road to Paris, it was the same thing you wanted. When you danced and sang for the boulevard crowds, you wanted to be good. I said haltingly. It was a good thing to make them happy, and for a little while I did. Yes, happy, she whispered. I could never explain to Nicholas, my friend, that it was so important to believe in a concept of goodness, even if we make it up ourselves. We don't really make it up. It's there, isn't it? "Oh, yes, it's there," she said. "It's there because we put it there." Such sadness. I couldn't speak. I watched the falling snow. I clasped her hand and felt her lips against my cheek. "You were born for me, my prince," she said. "You were tried and perfected, and in those first years when you went into your mother's bedchamber and brought her into the world of the undead with you, it was but a prefigurement of your waking me. I am your true mother, the mother who will never abandon you, and I have died and been reborn too. All the religions of the world, my prince, sing of you and of me." "How so?" I asked. "How can that be?" "Ah, but you know. You know." She took the sword from me and examined the old belt slowly, running it across the open palm of her right hand. Then she dropped it down into the rusted heap, the last remnants on earth of my mortal life, and it was as if a wind touched these things, blowing them slowly across the snow-covered floor until they were gone. "Discard your old illusions," she said, "your inhibitions. They are no more of use than these old weapons. Together we will make the myths of the world real." A chill cut through me, a dark chill of disbelief and then confusion, but her beauty overcame it. "You wanted to be a saint when you knelt in that chapel," she said. "Now you shall be a god with me." There were words of protest on the tip of my tongue. I was frightened. Some dark sense overcame me. Her words, what could they possibly mean? But suddenly I felt her arm around me, and we were rising out of the tower, up through the shattered roof. The wind was so fierce it cut my eyelids. I turned towards her. My right arm went round her waist, and I buried my head against her shoulder. I heard her soft voice in my ear telling me to sleep. It would be hours before the sun set on the land to which we were going, to the place of the first lesson. Lesson? Suddenly I was weeping again, clinging to her, weeping because I was lost. And she was all there was to cling to, and I was in terror now of what she would ask of me. Marius, coming together. They met again at the edge of the redwood forest, their clothes tattered, their eyes tearing from the wind. Pandora stood to the right of Marius, Santino to the left, and from the house across the clearing Mael came towards them, a lanky figure almost loping over the mown grass. Silently he embraced Marius. "Old friend," Marius said, but his voice had no vitality. Exhausted, he looked past Mael towards the lighted windows of the house. He sensed a great hidden dwelling within the mountain behind the visible structure, with its peaked and gabled roof. And what lay there waiting for him, for all of them? If only he had the slightest spirit for it. If only he could recapture the smallest part of his own soul. "I'm weary," he said to Mael. "I'm sick from the journey. Let me rest here a moment longer. Then I'll come." Marius did not despise the power to fly. As he knew Pandora did, nevertheless it invariably chastened him. He had been defenseless against it on this night of all nights, and he had now to feel the earth under him, to smell the forest, and to scan the distant house in a moment of uninterrupted quiet. His hair was tangled from the wind and still matted with dried blood. The simple gray wool jacket and pants he had taken from the ruins of his house barely gave him warmth. He brought the heavy black cloak close around him, not because the night here required it, but because he was still chilled and sore from the wind. Mael appeared not to like his hesitation, but to accept it. Suspiciously, he gazed at Pandora, whom he had never trusted, and then with open hostility he stared at Santino, who was busy brushing off his black garments and combing his fine, neatly trimmed black hair. For 1 second their eyes met, Santino bristling with viciousness. Then Mael turned away. Marius stood still listening, thinking. He could feel the last bit of healing in his body. It rather amazed him that he was once again whole. Even as mortals learn year by year that they are older and weaker, so immortals must learn that they are stronger than ever they imagined they would be. It maddened him at the moment. Scarcely an hour had passed since he was helped from the icy pit by Santino and Pandora, and now it was as if he had never been there, crushed and helpless, for 10 days and nights, visited again and again by the nightmares of the twins, yet nothing could ever be as it had been. The twins. The red-haired woman was inside the house waiting. Santino had told him this. Mael knew it too, but who was she? And why did he not want to know the answers? Why was this the blackest hour he had ever known? His body was fully healed, no doubt about it, but what was going to heal his soul? Armand in this strange wooden house at the base of the mountain. Armand again after all this time. Santino had told him about Armand also, and that the others, Louis and Gabrielle, had also been spared. Mael was studying him. He's waiting for you, he said. Your Amadeo. It was respectful, not cynical or impatient. And out of the great bank of memories that Marius carried forever with him, there came a long-neglected moment, startling in its purity. Mael coming to the Palazzo in Venice in the contented years of the 15th century, when Marius and Armand had known such happiness, and Mael seeing the mortal boy at work with the other apprentices on a mural, which Marius had only lately left to their less competent hands. Strange, how vivid the smell of the egg tempera, the smell of the candles, and that familiar smell, not unpleasant now in remembering, which permeated old Venice, the smell of the rottenness of things, of the dark and putrid waters of the canals. And so, you would make that one? Mael had asked with simple directness. When it's time, Marius had said dismissively. When it's time. Less than a year later he had made his little blunder. Come into my arms, young one. I can live without you no more. Marius stared at the distant house. My world trembles, and I think of him, my Amadeo, my Armand. The emotions he felt were suddenly as bittersweet as music. The blended orchestral melodies of recent centuries, the tragic strains of Brahms or Shostakovich, which he had come to love. But this was no time for cherishing this reunion, no time to feel the keen warmth of it, to be glad of it, and to say all the things to Armand that he so wanted to say. Bitterness was something shallow compared to his present state of mind. Should have destroyed them, the mother and the father, should have destroyed us all. Thank the gods, Mael said, that you did not. And why? Marius demanded. Tell me why. Pandora shuddered. He felt her arm come around his waist, and why did that make him so angry? He turned sharply to her. He wanted to strike her, push her away, but what he saw stopped him. She wasn't even looking at him, and her expression was so distant, so soul-weary, that he felt his own exhaustion all the more heavily. He wanted to weep. The well-being of Pandora had always been crucial to his own survival. He did not need to be near her. Better that he was not near her, but he had to know that she was somewhere, and continuing, and that they might meet again. What he saw now in her, had seen earlier, filled him with foreboding. If he felt bitterness, then Pandora felt despair. Come, Santino said, they're waiting. It was said with courtly politeness. I know, Marius answered. Ah, what a trio we are, Pandora whispered suddenly. She was spent, fragile, hungering for sleep and dreams, yet protectively she tightened her grip on Marius's waist. I can walk unaided, thank you, he said with uncharacteristic meanness, and to this one, the one he most loved. Walk then, she answered. And just for a second he saw her old warmth, even a spark of her old humor. She gave him a little shove and then started out alone towards the house. Acid. His thoughts were acid as he followed. He could not be of use to these immortals. Yet he walked on with Mael and Santino into the light streaming from the windows beyond. The redwood forest receded into shadow. Not a leaf moved, but the air was good here, warm here, full of fresh scents and without the sting of the north. Armand had made him want to weep. Then he saw the woman appear in the doorway, a sylph with long curly red hair catching the hallway light. He did not stop, but surely he felt a little intelligent fear. Old as Akasha she was, certainly. Her pale eyebrows were all but faded into the radiance of her countenance. Her mouth had no color anymore, and her eyes were not really her eyes. No, they had been taken from a mortal victim, and they were already failing her. She could not see very well as she looked at him. Ah, the blinded twin from the dreams she was. And she felt pain now in the delicate nerves connected to the stolen eyes. Pandora stopped at the edge of the steps. Marius went past her and up onto the porch. He stood before the red-haired woman, marveling at her height. She was as tall as he was, and at the fine symmetry of her mask-like face. "Yes, my old child," he murmured. He felt the longing for Armand again, like music, like Bartok's violin phrases played in a remote and safe place, where there was all the time in the world to hear. Yet he hated her, he hated all of them. He hated himself. The other twin, where was the other twin? Flashes of heated jungle, flashes of the vines torn, and the saplings breaking underfoot. He tried to reason, but he couldn't. Hatred poisoned him. Many a time he had witnessed this black denial of life in mortals. He had heard the wisest of them say, life is not worth it, and he had never fathomed it. Well, he understood it now. Vaguely he knew she had turned to those around him. She was welcoming Santino and Pandora into the house. As if in a trance, he saw her turn to lead the way. Her hair was so long it fell to her waist and back, a great mass of soft red curls, and he felt the urge to touch it. See if it was as soft as it looked. How positively remarkable that he could be distracted by something lovely at this moment, something impersonal, and that it could make him feel all right, as if nothing had happened, as if the world were good. He beheld the shrine intact again, the shrine at the center of his world. Ah, the idiot human brain, he thought, how it seizes whatever it can, and to think Armand was waiting so near. She led them through a series of large, sparely furnished rooms. The place, for all its openness, had the air of a citadel. The ceiling beams were enormous. The fireplaces, each with a roaring blaze, were no more than open stone hearths. So like the old meeting halls of Europe in the dark times, when the Roman roads had fallen to ruin and the Latin tongue had been forgotten, and the old warrior tribes had risen again, the Celts had been triumphant in the end, really. They were the ones who conquered Europe. Its feudal castles were no more than Celtic encampments, even in the modern states. The Celtic superstitions, more than Roman reason, lived on. But the appointments of this place harkened back to even earlier times. Men and women had lived in cities built like this before the invention of writing, in rooms of plaster and wood, among things woven or hammered by hand. He rather liked it. Ah, the idle brain again, he thought, that he could like something at such a time. But the places built by immortals always intrigued him, and this one was a place to study slowly, to come to know over a great span of time. Now they passed through a steel door and into the mountain itself. The smell of the raw earth enclosed him, yet they walked in new metal corridors with walls of tin. He could hear the generators, the computers, all the sweet, humming electrical sounds that had made him feel so safe in his own house. Up an iron stairs they went. It doubled back upon itself again and again as Maharet led them higher and higher. Now roughened walls revealed the innards of the mountain, its deep veins of colored clay and rock. Tiny ferns grew here, but where did the light come from? A skylight high above? Little portal to heaven? He glanced up thankfully at the bare glimmer of blue light. Finally, they emerged on a broad landing and entered a small darkened room. A door lay open to a much larger chamber where the others waited, but all Marius could see for the moment was the bright shock of distant firelight, and it made him turn his eyes away. Someone was waiting here in this little room for him, someone whose presence he had been unable, except by the most ordinary means, to detect. A figure who stood behind him now, and as Maharet went on into the large room, taking Pandora and Santino and Mael with her, he understood what was about to happen. To brace himself, he took a slow breath and closed his eyes. How trivial all his bitterness seemed. He thought of this one whose existence had been for centuries unbroken suffering, whose youth with all its needs had been rendered truly eternal, this one whom he had failed to save or to perfect. How many times over the years had he dreamed of such a reunion? And he had never had the courage for it, and now on this battlefield, in this time of ruin and upheaval, they were at last to meet. "My love," he whispered. He felt himself chastened suddenly as he had been earlier when he had flown up and up over the snowy wastes, past the realm of the indifferent clouds. Never had he spoken words more heartfelt. "My beautiful Amadeo," he said. And reaching out, he felt the touch of Armand's hand, supple still, this unnatural flesh, supple as if it were human, and cool, and so soft. He couldn't help himself now. He was weeping. He opened his eyes to see the boyish figure standing before him. Oh, such an expression, so accepting, so yielding. Then he opened his arms. Centuries ago in a palazzo in Venice, he had tried to capture in imperishable pigment the quality of this love. What had been its lesson? That in all the world no two souls contain the same secret, the same gift of devotion or abandon, that in a common child, a wounded child, he had found a blending of sadness and simple grace that would forever break his heart. This one had understood him. This one had loved him as no other ever had. Through his tears he saw no recrimination for the grand experiment that had gone wrong. He saw the face that he had painted now darkened slightly with the thing we naively call wisdom. And he saw the same love he had counted upon so totally in those lost nights. If only there were time to seek the quiet of the forest, some warm, secluded place among the soaring redwoods, and there talk together by the hour through long, unhurried nights. But the others waited, and so these moments were all the more precious and all the more sad. He tightened his arms around Armand. He kissed Armand's lips and his long, loose, vagabond hair. He ran his hand covetously over Armand's shoulders. He looked at the slim white hand he held in his own. Every detail he had sought to preserve forever on canvas, every detail he had certainly preserved in death. "They're waiting, aren't they?" he asked. "They won't give us more than a few moments now." Without judgment, Armand nodded. In a low, barely audible voice, he said, "It's enough. I always knew that we would meet again." Oh, the memories that the timbre of the voice brought back, the palazzo with its coffered ceilings, beds draped in red velvet, the figure of this boy rushing up the marble staircase, his face flushed from the winter wind off the Adriatic, his brown eyes on fire. Even in moments of the greatest jeopardy, the voice continued, "I knew we would meet before I would be free to die." "Free to die?" Marius responded. "We are always free to die, aren't we? What we must have now is the courage to do it, if indeed it is the right thing to do." Armand appeared to think on this for a moment, and the soft distance that crept into his face brought back the sadness again to Marius. "Yes, that's true," he said. "I love you," Marius whispered suddenly, passionately, as a mortal man might. "I have always loved you. I wish that I could believe in anything other than love at this moment. But I can't." Some small sound interrupted them. Maharet had come to the door. Marius slipped his arm around Armand's shoulder. There was one final moment of silence and understanding between them. And then they followed Maharet into an immense mountaintop room. All of glass it was, except for the wall behind him, and the distant iron chimney that hung from the ceiling above the blazing fire. No other light here save the blaze, and above and beyond, the sharp tips of the monstrous redwoods, and the bland Pacific sky, with its vaporous clouds and tiny cowardly stars. But it was beautiful still, wasn't it? Even if it was not the sky over the Bay of Naples, or seen from the flank of Annapurna, or from a vessel cast adrift in the middle of the blackened sea. The mere sweep of it was beautiful, and to think that only moments ago he had been high up there drifting in the darkness, seen only by his fellow travelers and by the stars themselves. The joy came back to him again as it had when he looked at Maharet's red hair. No sorrow as when he thought of Armand beside him, just joy, impersonal and transcendent, a reason to remain alive. It occurred to him suddenly that he wasn't very good at bitterness or regret, that he didn't have the stamina for them. And if he was to recapture his dignity, he had better shape up fast. A little laugh greeted him, friendly, unobtrusive, a little drunken maybe, the laugh of a fledgling who lacked common sense. He smiled in acknowledgement, darting a glance at the amused one, Daniel. Daniel, the anonymous boy of Interview with the Vampire. It hit him quickly that this was Armand's child, the only child Armand had ever made. A good start on the devil's road this creature had, this exuberant and intoxicated being. Strengthened with all that Armand had to give, quickly he surveyed the others who were gathered around the oval table. To his right, and some distance away, there was Gabrielle, with her blonde hair in a braid down her back, and her eyes full of undisguised anguish, and beside her, Louis, unguarded and passive as always, staring at Marius mutely as if in scientific inquiry, or worship, or both. Then came his beloved Pandora, her rippling brown hair free over her shoulders, and still speckled with the tiny, sparkling droplets of melted frost. Santino sat to her right finally, looking composed once more, all the dirt gone from his finely cut black velvet clothes. On his left sat Cayman, another ancient one who gave his name, silently and freely, a horrifying being actually, with a face even smoother than that of Maharet. Marius found he couldn't take his eyes off this one. Never had the faces of the mother and the father so startled him, though they too had these black eyes and jet black hair. It was the smile, wasn't it? The open, affable expression fixed there in spite of all the efforts of time to wash it away. The creature looked like a mystic or a saint, yet he was a savage killer. Recent feasts of human blood had softened his skin just a little and given a faint blush to his cheeks. Maël, shaggy and unkempt, as always, had taken the chair to Cayman's left, and after him came another old one, Eric, past 3,000 years by Marius's reckoning, gaunt and deceptively fragile in appearance, perhaps 30 when he died. His soft brown eyes regarded Marius thoughtfully. His handmade clothes were like exquisite replicas of the store-bought goods men of business wore today. But what was this other being? The one who sat to the right of Maharet, who stood directly opposite Marius at the far end. Now, this one truly gave him a shock. The other twin was his first rash conjecture, as he stared at her green eyes and her coppery red hair. But this being had been alive yesterday, surely, and he could find no explanation for her strength, her frigid whiteness, the piercing manner in which she stared at him, and the overwhelming telepathic power that emanated from her, a cascade of dark and finely delineated images which she seemed unable to control. She was seeing with uncanny accuracy the painting he had done centuries ago of his Amadeo, surrounded by black-winged angels as he knelt in prayer. A chill passed over Marius. "In the crypt of the Talamasca," he whispered. "My painting?" He laughed rudely, venomously. "And so it's there." The creature was frightened. She hadn't meant to reveal her thoughts, protective of the Talamasca and hopelessly confused. She shrank back into herself. Her body seemed to grow smaller, and yet to redouble its power. A monster with green eyes and delicate bones. Born yesterday, yes, exactly as he had figured it. There was living tissue in her, and suddenly he understood all about her. This one named Jessie had been made by Maharet. This one was an actual human descendant of the woman, and now she had become the fledgling of her ancient mother. The scope of it astonished him and frightened him slightly. The blood racing through the young one's veins had a potency that was unimaginable to Marius. She was absolutely without thirst, yet she wasn't even really dead. But he must stop this merciless and rummaging appraisal. They were, after all, waiting for him, yet he could not help but wonder where in God's name were his own mortal descendants, spawn of the nephews and nieces he had so loved when he was alive. For a few hundred years, true, he had followed their progress, but finally he could no longer recognize them. He could no longer recognize Rome itself, and he had let it all go into darkness as Rome had passed into darkness. Yet surely there were those walking the earth today who had that old family blood in their veins. He continued to stare at the red-haired young one, How she resembled her great mother, tall yet frail of bone, beautiful yet severe. Some great secret here, something to do with the lineage, the family. She wore soft, dark clothes rather similar to those of the Ancient One. Her hands were immaculate. She wore no scent or paint. They were all of them magnificent in their own way. The tall, heavily built Santino was elegant in his priestly black, with his lustrous black eyes and a sensuous mouth. Even the unkempt Mael had a savage, an overpowering presence as he glowered at the ancient woman with an obvious mixture of love and hate. Armand's angelic face was beyond description, and the boy Daniel a vision with his ashen hair and gleaming violet eyes. Was nobody ugly ever given immortality? Or did the dark magic simply make beauty out of whatever sacrifice was thrown into the blaze? But Gabrielle had been a lovely thing in life, surely, with all her son's courage and none of his impetuosity. And Louis, Louis, of course, had been picked for the exquisite bones of his face, for the depth of his green eyes. He had been picked for the inveterate attitude of somber appreciation that he revealed now. He looked like a human being lost among them, his face softened with color and feeling, his body curiously defenseless, his eyes wondering and sad. He even came and had an undeniable perfection of face and form, horrifying as the total effect had come to be. As for Pandora, he saw her alive and mortal when he looked at her. He saw the eager, innocent woman who had come to him so many eons ago in the ink-black nighttime streets of Antioch, begging to be made immortal, not the remote and melancholy being who sat so still now in her simple biblical robes, staring through the glass wall opposite her at the fading galaxy beyond the thickening clouds. Even Eric, bleached by the centuries and faintly radiant, retained, as Mahara did, an air of great human feeling made all the more appealing by a beguiling androgynous grace. The fact was, Marius had never laid eyes on such an assemblage, a gathering of immortals of all ages, from the newborn to the most ancient, and each endowed with immeasurable powers and weaknesses, even to the delirious young man whom Armand had skillfully created with all the unspent virtue of his virgin blood. Marius doubted that such a coven had ever come together before. And how did he fit into the picture, he who had been the eldest of his own carefully controlled universe, in which the ancients had been silent gods? The winds had cleansed him of the dried blood that had clung to his face and shoulder-length hair. His long, black cloak was damp from the snows from which he'd come, and, as he approached the table, as he waited belligerently for Mahara to tell him he might be seated, he fancied he looked as much the monster as the others did, his blue eyes surely cold with the animosity that was burning him from within. "Please," she said to him graciously. She gestured to the empty wooden chair before him, a place of honor, obviously, at the foot of the table, that is, if one conceded that she stood at the head. Comfortable it was, not like so much modern furniture. Its curved back felt good to him as he seated himself, and he could rest his hand on the arm. That was good, too. Armand took the empty chair to his right. Mahar had seated herself without a sound. She rested her hands with fingers folded on the polished wood before her. She bowed her head as if collecting her thoughts to begin. "Are we all that is left," Marius asked, "other than the queen and the brat prince and—" He paused. A ripple of silent confusion passed through the others. The mute twin. Where was she? What was the mystery? "Yes," Maharat answered soberly, "other than the queen and the brat prince and my sister. Yes, we are the only ones left, or the only ones left who count." She paused as if to let her words have their full effect. Her eyes gently took in the complete assembly. "Far off," she said, "there may be others, old ones who choose to remain apart, or those she hunts still who are doomed. But we are what remains in terms of destiny or decision or intent." "And my son?" Gabrielle said. Her voice was sharp, full of emotion and subtle disregard for those present. "Will none of you tell me what she's done with him and where he is?" She looked from the woman to Marius fearlessly and desperately. "Surely you have the power to know where he is." Her resemblance to Lestat touched Marius. It was from this one that Lestat had drawn his strength, without doubt. But there was a coldness in her that Lestat would never understand. "He's with her, as I've already told you," Cayman said, his voice deep and unhurried. "But beyond that, she doesn't let us know." Gabrielle did not believe it, obviously. There was a pulling away in her, a desire to leave here, to go off alone. Nothing could have forced the others away from the table. But this one had made no such commitment to the meeting, it was clear. Allow me to explain this, Maharat said, because it's of the utmost importance. The mother is skillful at cloaking herself, of course, but we of the early centuries have never been able to communicate silently with the mother and the father, or with each other. We are all simply too close to the source of the power that makes us what we are. We are deaf and blind to each other's minds, just as master and fledgling are among you. Only as time passed and more blood drinkers were created, did they acquire the power to communicate silently with each other, as we have done with mortals all along. Then Akasha couldn't find you, Marius said, you or Cayman, if you weren't with us. That's so. She must see us through your minds, or not at all. And so we must see her through the minds of others, except, of course, a certain sound we hear now and then on the approach of the powerful, a sound that has to do with a great exertion of energy and with breath and blood. Yes, that sound, Daniel murmured softly, that awful, relentless sound. But is there nowhere we can hide from her? Eric asked. Those of us she can hear and see? It was a young man's voice, of course, and with a heavy, undefinable accent, each word rather beautifully intoned. You know there isn't, Maharat answered with explicit patience. But we waste time talking of hiding. You are here either because she cannot kill you or she chooses not to. And so be it, we must go on. Or, she hasn't finished, Eric said disgustedly. She hasn't made up her infernal mind on the matter of who shall die and who shall live. I think you are safe here, Cayman said. She had her chance with everyone present, did she not? But that was just it, Marius realized. It was not at all clear that the mother had had her chance with Eric. Eric, who traveled, apparently, in the company of Maharat. Eric's eyes locked on Maharat. There was some quick, silent exchange, but it wasn't telepathic. What came clear to Marius was that Maharat had made Eric, and neither knew for certain whether Eric was too strong now for the mother. Maharat was pleading for calm. But Lestat, you can read his mind, can't you? Gabrielle said. Can't you discover them both through him? Not even I can always cover a pure and enormous distance, Maharat answered. If there were other blood drinkers left who could pick up Lestat's thoughts and relay them to me, well then of course I could find him in an instant. But in the main, those blood drinkers are no more. And Lestat has always been good at cloaking his presence. It's natural to him. It's always that way with the strong ones, the ones who are self-sufficient and aggressive. Wherever he is now, he instinctively shuts us out. She's taken him, Cayman said. He reached across the table and laid his hand on Gabrielle's hand. She'll reveal everything to us when she is ready. And if she chooses to harm Lestat in the meantime, there is absolutely nothing that any of us can do. Marius almost laughed. It seemed these ancient ones thought statements of absolute truth were a comfort. What a curious combination of vitality and passivity they were. Had it been so at the dawn of recorded history, when people sensed the inevitable, they stood stock still and accepted it? It was difficult for him to grasp. The mother won't harm Lestat, he said to Gabrielle, to all of them. She loves him. And, at its core, it's a common kind of love. She won't harm him because she doesn't want to harm herself. And she knows all the tricks, I'll wager, just as we know them. He won't be able to provoke her, though he's probably foolish enough to try. Gabrielle gave a little nod at that with a trace of a sad smile. It was her considered opinion that Lestat could provoke anyone finally, given enough time and opportunity, but she let it pass. She was neither consoled nor resigned. She sat back in the wooden chair and stared past them, as if they no longer existed. She felt no allegiance to this group. She felt no allegiance to anyone but Lestat. All right, then, she said coldly. Answer the crucial question. If I destroy this monster who's taken my son, do we all die? How the hell are you going to destroy her? Daniel asked in amazement. Eric sneered. She glanced at Daniel dismissively. Eric she ignored. She looked at Maharat. Well, is the old myth true? If I waste this bitch, to use the vernacular, do I waste the rest of us too? There was faint laughter in the gathering. Marius shook his head, but Maharat gave a little smile of acknowledgement as she nodded. Yes. It was tried in the earlier times. It was tried by many a fool who didn't believe it. The spirit who inhabits her animates us all. Destroy the host, you destroy the power. The young die first. The old wither slowly. The eldest perhaps would go last, but she is the queen of the damned, and the damned can't live without her. Enkel was only her consort, and that is why it does not matter now that she has slain him and drunk his blood to the last drop. The queen of the damned. Marius whispered it aloud softly. There had been a strange inflection when Maharet had said it, as if memories had stirred in her, painful and awful, and undimmed by time, undimmed as the dreams were undimmed. Again he had a sense of the starkness and severity of these ancient beings for whom language perhaps, and all the thoughts governed by it, had not been needlessly complex. Gabrielle came and said, pronouncing the name exquisitely, "We cannot help Lestat. We must use this time to make a plan." He turned to Maharet. "The dreams, Maharet. Why have the dreams come to us now? This is what we all want to know." There was a protracted silence. All present had known in some form these dreams. Only lightly had they touched Gabrielle and Louis, so lightly in fact that Gabrielle had before this night given no thought to them. And Louis, frightened by Lestat, had pushed them out of his mind. Even Pandora, who confessed no personal knowledge of them, had told Marius of Azim's warning. Santino had called them horrid trances from which he couldn't escape. Marius knew now that they had been a noxious spell for the young ones, Jessie and Danielle almost as cruel as they had been for him. Yet Maharet did not respond. The pain in her eyes had intensified. Marius felt it like a soundless vibration. He felt the spasms in the tiny nerves. He bent forward slightly, folding his hands before him on the table. "Maharet," he said, "your sister is sending the dreams, isn't this so?" No answer. "Where's Makare?" He pushed. Silence again. He felt the pain in her, and he was sorry. Very sorry once more for the bluntness of his speech, but if he was to be of use here, he must push things to a conclusion. He thought of Akasha in the shrine again, though why, he didn't know. He thought of the smile on her face, he thought of Lestat protectively, desperately, but Lestat was just a symbol now, a symbol of himself, of them all. Maharet was looking at him in the strangest way, as if he were a mystery to her. She looked at the others. Finally she spoke. "You witnessed our separation," she said quietly, "all of you. You saw it in the dreams. You saw the mob surround me and my sister. You saw them force us apart in stone coffins they placed us. Makare unable to cry out to me because they had cut out her tongue, and I unable to see her for the last time because they had taken my eyes. But I saw through the minds of those who hurt us. I knew it was to the seashores that we were being taken, Makare to the west and I to the east. 10 nights I drifted on the raft of pitch and logs, entombed alive in the stone coffin. And finally, when the raft sank and the water lifted the stone lid, I was free. Blind, ravenous, I swam ashore and stole from the first poor mortal. I encountered the eyes to see and the blood to live, but Makare, into the great western ocean she had been cast, the waters that ran to the end of the world. Yet from that first night on, I searched for her. I searched through Europe, through Asia, through the southern jungles, and the frozen lands of the north, century after century. I searched, finally crossing the western ocean when mortals did, to take my quest to the new world as well. I never found my sister. I never found a mortal or immortal who had set eyes upon her or heard her name. Then in this century, in the years after the Second Great War, in the high mountain jungles of Peru, the indisputable evidence of my sister's presence was discovered by a lone archaeologist. On the walls of a shallow cave, pictures my sister had created of stick figures and crude pigment which told the tale of our lives together, the sufferings you all know. But 6,000 years ago, these drawings had been carved into the stone. And 6,000 years ago, my sister had been taken from me. No other evidence of her existence was ever found. Yet I have never abandoned the hope of finding my sister. I have always known, as only a twin might, that she walks this earth still, that I am not here alone. And now, within these last 10 nights, I have, for the first time, proof that my sister is still with me. It has come to me through the dreams. These are Makare's thoughts, Makare's images, Makare's rancor and pain. Silence. All eyes were fixed on her. Marius was quietly stunned. He feared to be the one to speak again, but this was worse than he had imagined, and the implications were now entirely clear. The origin of these dreams was almost certainly not a conscious survivor of the millennia. Rather, the visions had very possibly come from one who had no more mind now than an animal, in whom memory is a spur to action which the animal does not question or understand. It would explain their clarity, it would explain their repetition, and the flashes he had seen of something moving through the jungles. This was Makar herself. Yes, Mahar said immediately. In the jungles, walking, she whispered, the words of the dying archaeologist scribbled on a piece of paper, and left for me to find when I came. In the jungles, walking. But where? It was Louis who broke the silence. Then the dreams may not be a deliberate message, he said, his words marked by a slight French accent. They may simply be the outpouring of a tortured soul. No, they are a message, Cayman said. They are a warning. They are meant for all of us, and for the mother as well. But how can you say this? Gabrielle asked him. We don't know what her mind is now, or that she even knows that we are here. You don't know the whole story, Cayman said. I know it. Maharet will tell it. He looked to Maharet. I saw her, Jessie said unobtrusively, her voice tentative as she looked at Maharet. She's crossed the great river. She's coming. I saw her. No, that's not right. I saw as if I were she. Yes, Marius answered, through her eyes. I saw her red hair when I looked down, Jessie said. I saw the jungle giving way with each step. The dreams must be a communication, Maël said with sudden impatience. For why else would the message be so strong? Our private thoughts don't carry such power. She raises her voice. She wants someone or something to know what she is thinking. Or she is obsessed and acting upon that obsession, Marius answered. And moving towards a certain goal, he paused. To be united with you, her sister. What else could she possibly want? No, Cayman said, that is not her goal. Again he looked at Maharet. She has a promise to keep to the mother, and that is what the dreams mean. Maharet studied him for a moment in silence. It seemed this was almost beyond her endurance, this discussion of her sister. Yet she fortified herself silently for the ordeal that lay ahead. We were there in the beginning, Cayman said. We were the first children of the mother, and in these dreams lies the story of how it began. Then you must tell us all of it. Marius said as gently as he could. Yes, Maharet sighed, and I will. She looked at each of them in turn, and then back to Jessie. I must tell you the whole story, she said, so that you can understand what we may be powerless to avert. You see, this is not merely the story of the beginning. It may be the story of the end as well. She sighed suddenly as if the prospect were too much for her. Our world has never seen such upheaval, she said, looking at Marius. Lestat's music, the rising of the mother, so much death. She looked down for a moment as if collecting herself again for the effort, and then she glanced at Cayman and at Jessie, who were the ones she most loved. I have never told it before, she said, as if pleading for indulgence. It has for me now the hard purity of mythology, those times when I was alive, when I could still see the sun. But in this mythology is rooted all the truths that I know, and if we go back, we may find the future and the means to change it. The very least that we can do is seek to understand. A hush fell. All waited with respectful patience for her to begin. In the beginning, she said, we were witches, my sister and I. We talked to the spirits, and the spirits loved us, until she sent her soldiers into our land. Lestat, the queen of heaven. She let me go. Instantly, I began to plummet. The wind was a roar in my ears. But the worst part was that I couldn't see. I heard her say, rise. There was a moment of exquisite helplessness. I was plunging towards the earth and nothing was going to stop it. Then I looked up, my eyes stinging, the clouds closing over me. And I remembered the tower and the feeling of rising. I made the decision, go up, and my descent stopped at once. It was as if a current of air had caught me. I went up hundreds of feet in one instant, and then the clouds were below me, a white light that I could scarcely see. I decided to drift. Why did I have to go anywhere for the moment? Maybe I could open my eyes fully and see through the wind if I wasn't afraid of the pain. She was laughing somewhere in my head or over it. I didn't know which. Come on, Prince, come higher. I spun around and shot upwards again until I saw her coming towards me, her garments swirling about her heavy plates lifted more gently by the wind. She caught me and kissed me. I tried to steady myself, holding on to her, to look down and really see something through the breaks in the clouds. Mountains, snow-covered and dazzling in the moonlight with great bluish flanks that disappeared into deep valleys of fathomless snow. "Lift me now," she whispered in my ear. "Carry me to the northwest." "I don't know the direction." "Yes, you do. The body knows it. Your mind knows it. Don't ask them which way it is. Tell them that is the way you wish to go. You know the principles. When you lifted your rifle, you looked at the wolf running. You didn't calculate the distance or the speed of the bullet. You fired. The wolf went down." I rose again with that same incredible buoyancy, and then I realized she had become a great weight in my arm. Her eyes were fixed on me. She was making me carry her. I smiled. I think I laughed aloud. I lifted her and kissed her again and continued the ascent without interruption to the northwest. That is, to the right, and to the right again, and higher. My mind did know it. It knew the terrain over which we'd come. I made a little artful turn and then another. I was spinning, clutching her close to me, rather loving the weight of her body, the press of her breasts against me, and her lips again closing delicately on mine. She drew close to my ear. "Do you hear it?" she asked. I listened. The wind seemed annihilating, yet there came a dull chorus from the earth, human voices chanting. Some in time with each other, others at random, voices praying aloud in an Asian tongue. Far, far away I could hear them, and then near at hand, important to distinguish the two sounds. First, there was a long procession of worshippers ascending through the mountain passes and over the cliffs, chanting to keep themselves alive as they trudged on, in spite of weariness and cold, and within a building, a loud ecstatic chorus, chanting fiercely over the clang of cymbals and drums. I gathered her head close to mine and looked down, but the clouds had become a solid bed of whiteness. Yet I could see through the minds of the worshippers the brilliant vision of a courtyard and a temple of marble arches and vast painted rooms. The procession wound towards the temple. "I want to see it," I said. She didn't answer, but she didn't stop me as I drifted downward, stretching out on the air, as if I were a bird flying, yet descending until we were in the very middle of the clouds. She had become light again, as if she were nothing. And as we left the sea of whiteness, I saw the temple gleaming below, a tiny clay model of itself, it seemed, the terrain buckling here and there beneath its meandering walls. The stench of burning bodies rose from its blazing pyres, and towards this cluster of roofs and towers men and women wound their way along perilous paths from as far as I could see. "Tell me who is inside, my prince," she said. "Tell me who is the god of this temple." "See it, draw close to it," the old trick, but all at once I began to fall. I let out a terrible cry. She caught me. "More care, my prince," she said, steadying me. I thought my heart was going to burst. "You cannot move out of your body to look into the temple and fly at the same time. Look through the eyes of the mortals the way you did it before." I was still shaking, clutching hold of her. "I'll drop you again if you don't calm yourself," she said gently. "Tell your heart to do as you would have it do." I gave a great sigh. My body ached suddenly from the constant force of the wind, and my eyes, they were stinging so badly again I couldn't see anything. But I tried to subdue these little pains, or rather to ignore them, as if they didn't exist. I took hold of her firmly and started down, telling myself to go slowly, and then again I tried to find the minds of the mortals and see what they saw. Gilded walls, cusped arches, every surface glittering with decoration, incense rising, mingling with the scent of fresh blood. In blurred snatches I saw him, the god of the temple. "A vampire," I whispered, "a blood-sucking devil. He draws them to himself and slaughters them at his leisure. The place reeks of death." "And so there shall be more death," she whispered, kissing my face again tenderly. "Now, very fast, so fast mortal eyes can't see you. Bring us down to the courtyard beside the funeral pyre." I could have sworn it was done before I decided it. I'd done no more than consider the idea, and there I was, fallen against a rough plaster wall, with hard stones under my feet, trembling, my head reeling, my innards grinding in pain. My body wanted to keep going down, right through solid rock. Sinking back against the wall, I heard the chanting before I could see anything. I smelt the fire, the bodies burning, then I saw the flames. "That was very clumsy, my prince," she said softly. "We almost struck the wall. I don't exactly know how it happened." "Ah, but that's the key," she said, "the word exact. The spirit in you obeys swiftly and completely. Consider a little more. You don't cease to hear and see as you descend. It merely happens faster than you realize. Do you know the pure mechanics of snapping your fingers? No, you do not. Yet you can do it. A mortal child can do it." I nodded. The principle was clear all right, as it had been with the target and the gun. Merely a matter of degrees, I said, and of surrender, fearless surrender. I nodded. The truth was I wanted to fall on a soft bed and sleep. I blinked my eyes at the roaring fire, the sight of the bodies going black in the flames. One of them wasn't dead, an arm was raised, fingers curled. Now he was dead. Poor devil, all right. Her cold hand touched my cheek, it touched my lips, and then she smoothed back the tangled hair of my head. You've never had a teacher, have you? She asked. Magnus orphaned you the night he made you. Your father and brothers were fools. As for your mother, she hated her children. I've always been my own teacher, I said soberly, and I must confess I've always been my favorite pupil as well. Laughter. Maybe it was a little conspiracy, I said, of pupil and teacher, but as you said, there was never anyone else. She was smiling at me. The fire was playing in her eyes. Her face was luminous, frighteningly beautiful. Surrender, she said, and I'll teach you things you never dreamed of. You've never known battle, real battle. You've never felt the purity of a righteous cause. I didn't answer. I felt dizzy, not merely from the long journey through the air, but from the gentle caress of her words and the fathomless blackness of her eyes. It seemed a great part of her beauty was the sweetness of her expression, the serenity of it, the way that her eyes held steady even when the glistening white flesh of her face moved suddenly with a smile or a subtle frown. I knew if I let myself, I'd be terrified of what was happening. She must have known it too. She took me in her arms again. Drink, Prince, she whispered. Take the strength you need to do as I would have you do. I don't know how many moments passed when she pulled away. I was drugged for an instant, and the clarity was, as always, overwhelming. The monotonous music of the temple was thundering through the walls. Azim, Azim, Azim. As she drew me along after her, it seemed my body didn't exist anymore, except as a vision I kept in place. I felt of my own face, the bones beneath my skin, to touch something solid that was myself, but this skin, this sensation, it was utterly new, what was left of me. The wooden doors opened as if, by magic before us, we passed silently into a long corridor of slender white marble pillars and scalloped arches, but this was but the outer border of an immense central room, and the room was filled with frenzied, screaming worshippers who did not even see us or sense our presence, as they continued to dance, to chant, to leap into the air, in the hopes of glimpsing their one and only God. Keep at my side, Lestat, she said, the voice cutting through the din as if I'd been touched by a velvet glove. The crowd parted violently, bodies thrust to right and left. Screaming replaced the chant immediately. The room was in chaos. As a path lay open for us to the center of the room, the cymbals and drums were silenced. Moans and soft, piteous cries surrounded us. Then a great sigh of wonder rose as Akasha stepped forward and threw back her veil. Many feet away in the center of the ornate floor stood the blood god Azim, clothed in a black silk turban and jeweled robes. His face was disfigured with fury as he stared at Akasha, as he stared at me. Prayers rose from the crowd around us. A shrill voice cried out an anthem to the Eternal Mother. Silence, Azim commanded. I didn't know the language, but I understood the word. I could hear the sound of human blood in his voice. I could see it rushing through his veins. Never, in fact, had I seen any vampire or blood drinker so choked with human blood as was this one. He was as old as Marius, surely, yet his skin had a dark, golden gleam. A thin veil of blood sweat covered it completely, even to the backs of his large, soft-looking hands. You dare to come into my temple, he said, and again the language itself eluded me, but the meaning was telepathically clear. You will die now, Akasha said, the voice even softer than it had been a moment ago. You who have misled these hopeless innocents, you who have fed upon their lives and their blood like a bloated leech. Screams rose from the worshippers, cries for mercy. Again, Azim told them to be quiet. What right have you to condemn my worship, he cried, pointing his finger at us, you who have sat silent on your throne since the beginning of time. Time did not begin with you, my cursed beauty, Akasha answered. I was old when you were born, and I am risen now to rule as I was meant to rule. You shall die as a lesson to your people. You are my first great Martyr, you shall die now. He tried to run at her, and I tried to step between them, but it was all too fast to be seen. She caught him by some invisible means and shoved him backwards, so that his feet slid across the marble tile and he teetered, almost falling and then dancing as he sought to right himself, his eyes rolling up into his head. A deep gurgling cry came out of him. He was burning. His garments were burning, and then the smoke rose from him, gray and thin and writhing in the gloom as the terrified crowd gave way to screams and wails. He was twisting as the heat consumed him. Then suddenly bent double he rose, staring at her, and flew at her with his arms out. It seemed he would reach her before she thought what to do. And again I tried to step before her, and with a quick shove of her right hand she threw me back into the human swarm. There were half-naked bodies all around, struggling to get away from me as I caught my balance. I spun around and saw him poised not 3 feet from her, snarling at her and trying to reach her over some invisible and unsurmountable force. Die, damnable one, she cried out. I clamped my hands over my ears. Go into the pit of perdition I created for you now. Azim's head exploded. Smoke and flame poured out of his ruptured skull. His eyes turned black. With a flash, his entire frame ignited. Yet he went down in a human posture, his fists raised against her, his legs curling as if he meant to try to stand again. Then his form disappeared utterly in a great orange blaze. Panic descended upon the crowd, just as it had upon the rock fans outside the concert hall when the fires had broken out, and Gabrielle and Louis and I had made our escape. Yet it seemed the hysteria here reached a more dangerous pitch. Bodies crashed against the slender marble pillars. Men and women were crushed instantly as others rushed over them to the doors. Akasha turned full circle, her garments caught in a brief dance of black and white silk around her, and everywhere human beings were caught as if by invisible hands and flung to the floor. Their bodies went into convulsions. The women looking down at the stricken victims wailed and tore their hair. It took me a moment to realize what was happening, that she was killing the men. It wasn't fire, it was some invisible attack upon the vital organs. Blood poured from their ears and their eyes as they expired. Enraged, several of the women ran at her only to meet the same fate. The men who attacked her were vanquished instantly. Then I heard her voice inside my head. Kill them, Lestat. Slaughter the males to the last one. I was paralyzed. I stood beside her, lest one of them get close to her, but they didn't have a chance. This was beyond nightmare, beyond the stupid horrors to which I'd been a party all my accursed life. Suddenly she was standing in front of me, grasping my arms. Her soft, icy voice had become an engulfing sound in my brain. My prince, my love, you will do this for me. Slaughter the males so that the legend of their punishment will surpass the legend of the temple. They are the henchmen of the blood god. The women are helpless. Punish the males in my name. Oh, God help me. Please don't ask this of me, I whispered. They are pitiful humans. The crowd seemed to have lost its spirit. Those who had run into the rear yard were trapped. The dead in the morning lay everywhere around us, while from the ignorant multitude at the front gates there rose the most piteous pleas. Let them go, Akasha, please, I said to her. Had I ever in my life begged for anything as I did now? What had these poor beings to do with us? She drew closer to me. I couldn't see anything now but her black eyes. My love, this is divine war, not the loathsome feeding upon human life which you have done night after night without scheme or reason, save to survive. You kill now in my name and for my cause, and I give you the greatest freedom ever given man. I tell you that to slay your mortal brother is right. Now use the new power I've given you. Choose your victims one by one. Use your invisible strength or the strength of your hands. My head was spinning. Had I this power to make men drop in their tracks? I looked around me in the smoky chamber where the incense still poured from the censers and bodies tumbled over one another. Men and women embracing each other in terror, others crawling into corners as if there they would be safe. There is no life for them now save in the lesson, she said. Do as I command. It seemed I saw a vision, for surely this wasn't from my heart or mind. I saw a thin, emaciated form rise before me. I gritted my teeth as I glared at it, concentrating my malice as if it were a laser. And then I saw the victim rise off his feet and tumble backwards as the blood came out of his mouth. Lifeless, withered, he fell to the floor. It had been like a spasm. And then as effortless as shouting, as throwing one's voice out unseen yet powerful over a great space. Yes, kill them. Strike for the tender organs, rupture them, make the blood flow. You know that you have always wanted to do it, to kill as if it were nothing, to destroy without scruple or regret. It was true, so true, but it was also forbidden, forbidden as nothing else on earth is forbidden. My love, it is as common as hunger, as common as time, and now you have my power and command. You and I shall put an end to it through what we will do now. A young man rushed at me, crazed, hands out to catch my throat. Kill him. He cursed me as I drove him backwards with the invisible power, feeling the spasm deep in my throat and my belly. And then a sudden tightening in the temples. I felt it touching him. I felt it pouring out of me. I felt it as surely as if I had penetrated his skull with my fingers and was squeezing his brain. Seeing it would have been crude. There was no need to see it. All I needed to see was the blood spurting from his mouth and his ears and down his naked chest. Oh, was she ever right how I had wanted to do it? How I had dreamed of it in my earliest mortal years? The sheer bliss of killing them under all their names, which were the same name. Enemy those who deserved killing, those who were born for killing. Killing with full force, my body turning to solid muscle. My teeth clenched, my hatred and my invisible strength made one. In all directions they ran, but that only further inflamed me. I drove them back, the power slamming them into the walls. I aimed for the heart with this invisible tongue and heard the heart when it burst. I turned round and round, directing it carefully, yet instantly at this one, and that one, and then another as he ran through the doorway, and yet another as he rushed down the corridor, and yet another as he tore the lamp from its chains and hurled it foolishly at me. Into the back rooms of the temple I pursued them, with exhilarating ease through the heaps of gold and silver, tossing them over on their backs as if with long, invisible fingers, then clamping those invisible fingers on their arteries until the blood gushed through the bursting flesh. The women crowded together weeping, others fled. I heard bones break as I walked over the bodies, and then I realized that she too was killing them, that we were doing it together, and the room was now littered with the mutilated and the dead. A dark, rank smell of blood permeated everything. The fresh, cold wind could not dispel it. The air was filled with soft, despairing cries. A giant of a man raced at me, eyes bulging as he tried to stop me with a great curved sword. In rage, I snatched the sword from him and sliced through his neck. Right through the bone the blade went, breaking as it did so, and head and broken blade fell at my feet. I kicked aside the body. I went in the courtyard and stared at those who shrank from me in terror. I had no more reason, no more conscience. It was a mindless game to chase them, corner them, thrust aside the women behind whom they hid or who struggled so pitifully to hide them, and aim the power at the right place, to pump the power at that vulnerable spot until they lay still. The front gates, she was calling me. The men in the courtyard were dead. The women were tearing their hair, sobbing. I walked through the ruined temple, through the mourners, and the dead they mourned. The crowd at the gates was on its knees in the snow, ignorant of what had gone on inside, voices raised in desperate entreaty. Admit me to the chamber, admit me to the vision and the hunger of the Lord. At the sight of Akasha, their cries rose in volume. They reached out to touch her garments as the locks broke and the gate swung open. The wind howled down the mountain pass. The bell in the tower above gave a faint, hollow sound. Again I shoved them down, rupturing brains and hearts and arteries. I saw their thin arms flung out in the snow. The wind itself stank of blood. Akasha's voice cut through the horrid screams, telling the women to draw back and away, and they would be safe. Finally, I was killing so fast I couldn't even see it anymore. The males must die. I was rushing towards completion, that every single male thing that moved or stirred or moaned should be dead. Like an angel, I moved on, down the winding path, with an invisible sword, and finally all the way down the cliff they dropped to their knees and waited for death. In a ghastly passivity, they accepted it. Suddenly I felt her holding me, though she was nowhere near me. I heard her voice in my head, "Well done, my prince." I couldn't stop. This invisible thing was one of my limbs now. I couldn't withdraw it and bring it back into myself. It was as if I was poised to take a breath. And if I did not take that breath, I should die. But she held me motionless, and a great calm was coming over me, as if a drug had been fed into my veins. Finally, I grew still, and the power concentrated itself within me and became part of me and nothing more. Slowly, I turned around. I looked at the clear snowy peaks, the perfectly black sky, and at the long line of dark bodies that lay on the path from the temple gates. The women were clinging to one another, sobbing in disbelief or giving off low and terrible moans. I smelled death as I have never smelled it. I looked down at the bits of flesh and gore that had splashed my garments. But my hands were so white and clean, dear God, I didn't do it. Not me, I didn't. And my hands, they are clean. Oh, but I had. And what am I that I could do it, that I loved it beyond all reason, loved it as men have always loved it in the absolute moral freedom of war. It seemed a silence had fallen. If the women still cried, I didn't hear them. I didn't hear the wind either. I was moving, though why, I didn't know. I had dropped down to my knees and I reached out for the last man I had slain, who was flung like broken sticks in the snow, and I put my hand into the blood on his mouth, and then I smeared this blood all over both my hands and pressed them to my face. Never had I killed in 200 years that I hadn't tasted the blood and taken it, along with the life, into myself. And that was a monstrous thing, but more had died here in these few ghastly moments than all those I'd ever sent to their untimely graves. And it had been done with the ease of thought and breath. Oh, this can never be atoned for. This can never, never be justified. I stood staring at the snow through my bloody fingers, weeping and yet hating that as well. Then gradually I realized that some change had taken place with the women. Something was happening around me, and I could feel it, as if the cold air had been warmed and the wind had risen and left the steep slope undisturbed. Then the change seemed to enter into me, subduing my anguish and even slowing the beat of my heart. The crying had ceased. Indeed, the women were moving by twos and threes down the path as if in a trance, stepping over the dead. It seemed that sweet music was playing and that the earth had suddenly yielded spring flowers of every color and description, and that the air was full of perfume. Yet these things weren't happening, were they, in a haze of muted colors? The women passed me in rags and silks and dark cloaks. I shook myself all over. I had to think clearly. This was no time for disorientation. This power in these dead bodies were no dream, and I could not, absolutely could not, yield to this overwhelming sense of well-being and peace. Akasha, I whispered. Then lifting my eyes, not because I wanted to, but because I had to, I saw her standing on a far promontory, and the women, young and old, were moving towards her, some so weak from the cold and from hunger that others had to carry them over the frozen ground. A hush had fallen over all things. Without words, she began to speak to those assembled before her. It seemed she addressed them in their own language, or in something quite beyond specific language. I couldn't tell. In a daze, I saw her stretch out her arms to them. Her black hair spilled down on her white shoulders, and the folds of her long, simple gown barely moved in the soundless wind. It struck me that never in all my life had I beheld anything quite as beautiful as she was. And it was not merely the sum of her physical attributes, it was the pure serenity, the essence that I perceived with my innermost soul. A lovely euphoria came over me as she spoke. Do not be afraid, she told them. The bloody reign of your God is over, and now you may return to the truth. Soft anthems rose from the worshippers. Some dipped their foreheads to the ground before her, and it appeared that this pleased her, or at least that she would allow it. You must return now to your villages, she said. You must tell those who knew of the blood god that he is dead. The Queen of Heaven has destroyed him. The Queen will destroy all those males who still believe in him. The Queen of Heaven will bring a new reign of peace on earth. There will be death for the males who have oppressed you, but you must wait for my sign. As she paused, the anthems rose again. The Queen of Heaven, the Goddess, the Good Mother, the old litany sung in 1,000 tongues the world over was finding a new form. I shuddered. I made myself shudder. I had to penetrate that spell. It was a trick of the power, just as the killing had been a trick of the power, something definable and measurable, yet I remained drugged by the sight of her, and by the anthems, by the soft embrace of this feeling. All is well, all is as it should be. We are all safe. Somewhere from the sunlit recesses of my mortal memory, a day came back, a day like many before it, when in the month of May in our village we had crowned a statue of the Virgin amid banks of sweet-smelling flowers, when we had sung exquisite hymns. Ah, the loveliness of that moment, when the crown of white lilies had been lifted to the Virgin's veiled head. I'd gone home that night singing those hymns. In an old prayer book I'd found a picture of the Virgin, and it had filled me with enchantment and wondrous religious fervor, such as I felt now. And from somewhere deeper in me, even, where the sun had never penetrated, came the realization that if I believed in her and what she was saying, then this unspeakable thing, this slaughter that I had committed against fragile and helpless mortals, would somehow be redeemed. You kill now in my name and for my cause, and I give you the greatest freedom ever given man. I tell you that to slay your brother is right. Go on, she said aloud. Leave this temple forever. Leave the dead to the snow and the winds. Tell the people. A new era is coming when those males who glorify death and killing shall reap their reward, and the era of peace shall be yours. I will come again to you. I will show you the way. Await my coming, and I will tell you then what you must do. For now, believe in me and what you have seen here, and tell others that they too may believe. Let the men come and see what awaits them. Wait for signs from me. In a body they moved to obey her command. They ran down the mountain path towards those distant worshippers who had fled the massacre. Their cries rose thin and ecstatic in the snowy void. The wind gusted through the valley. High on the hill the temple bell gave another dull peal. The wind tore at the scant garments of the dead. The snow had begun to fall, softly and then thickly, covering brown legs and arms and faces with open eyes. The sense of well-being had dissipated, and all the raw aspects of the moment were clear and inescapable again. These women, this visitation, bodies in the snow, undeniable displays of power, disruptive and overwhelming. Then a soft little sound broke the silence, things shattering in the temple above, things falling, breaking apart. I turned and looked at her. She stood still on the little promontory, the cloak very loose over her shoulders, her flesh as white as the falling snow. Her eyes were fixed on the temple, and as the sounds continued, I knew what was happening within. Jars of oil breaking, braziers falling, the soft whisper of cloth exploding into flame. Finally, the smoke rose thick and black, billowing from the bell tower, and from over the rear wall, the bell tower trembled. A great roaring noise echoed against the far cliffs, and then the stones broke loose, the tower collapsed. It fell down into the valley, and the bell, with one final peal, disappeared into the soft white abyss. The temple was consumed in fire. I stared at it, my eyes watering from the smoke that blew down over the path, carrying with it tiny ashes and bits of soot. Vaguely, I was aware that my body wasn't cold despite the snow, that it wasn't tired from the exertion of killing. Indeed, my flesh was whiter than it had been, and my lungs took in the air so efficiently that I couldn't hear my own breathing. Even my heart was softer, steadier, only my soul was bruised and sore. For the first time ever in my life, either immortal or mortal, I was afraid that I might die. I was afraid that she might destroy me, and with reason, because I simply could not do again what I'd just done. I could not be part of this design, and I prayed I couldn't be made to do it, that I would have the strength to refuse. I felt her hands on my shoulders. Turn and look at me, Lestat, she said. I did as she asked, and there it was again, the most seductive beauty I'd ever beheld. And I'm yours, my love. You are my only true companion, my finest instrument. You know this, do you not? Again, a deliberate shudder. Where in God's name are you, Lestat? Are you going to shrink from speaking your heart? Akasha, help me, I whispered. Tell me, why did you want me to do this killing? What did you mean when you told them that the males would be punished, that there would be a reign of peace on earth? How stupid my words sounded, looking into her eyes. I could believe she was the goddess. It was as if she drew my conviction out of me, as if it were merely blood. I was quaking suddenly with fear, quaking. I knew what the word meant for the first time. I tried to say more, but I merely stammered. Finally, I blurted it out. In the name of what morality will all this be done? In the name of my morality, she answered, the faint little smile as beautiful as before. I am the reason, the justification, the right by which it is done. Her voice was cold with anger, but her blank, sweet expression had not changed. Now, listen to me, beautiful one, she said. I love you. You've awakened me from my long sleep into my great purpose. It gives me joy merely to look at you, to see the light in your blue eyes, and to hear the sound of your voice. It would wound me beyond your understanding of pain to see you die. But as the stars are my witness, you will aid me in my mission. Or you will be no more than the instrument for the commencement, as Judas was to Christ. And I shall destroy you as Christ destroyed Judas once your usefulness is past. Rage overcame me. I couldn't help myself. The shift from fear to anger was so fast. I was boiling inside. But how do you dare to do these things, I asked, to send these ignorant souls abroad with mad lies? She stared at me in silence, it seemed. She would strike out of me. Her face became that of a statue again. And I thought, well, the moment is now. I will die the way I saw Azim die. I can't save Gabrielle or Louis. I can't save Armand. I won't fight because it's useless. I won't move when it happens. I'll go deep into myself, perhaps, if I must run from the pain. I'll find some last illusion like baby Jenks did and cling to it until I am no longer Lestat. She didn't move. The fires on the hill were burning down. The snow was coming more thickly, and she had become like a ghost standing there in the silent snowfall, white as the snow was white. You really aren't afraid of anything, are you? She said. I'm afraid of you, I said. Oh no, I do not think so. I nodded. I am. And I'll tell you what else I am. Vermin on the face of the earth, nothing more than that. A loathsome killer of human beings, but I know that's what I am. I do not pretend to be what I am not. You have told these ignorant people that you are the Queen of Heaven. How do you mean to redeem those words and what they will accomplish among stupid and innocent minds? Such arrogance, she said softly, such incredible arrogance, and yet I love you. I love your courage, even your rashness, which has always been your saving grace. I even love your stupidity. Don't you understand? There is no promise now that I cannot keep. I shall make the myths over. I am the Queen of Heaven, and heaven shall reign on earth finally. I am anything that I say I am. Oh Lord God, I whispered, do not speak those hollow words, those words that have never meant anything to anyone. You stand in the presence of the only goddess you will ever know. You are the only God these people will ever know. Well, you must think like a god now, my beauty. You must reach for something beyond your selfish little ambitions. Don't you realize what's taken place? I shook my head. I don't know anything. I'm going mad. She laughed. She threw back her head and laughed. We are what they dream of, Lestat. We cannot disappoint them. If we did, the truth implicit in the earth beneath our feet would be betrayed. She turned away from me. She went back up again to the small outcropping of snow-covered rock where she had stood before. She was looking down into the valley at the path that cut along the sheer cliff beneath her, at the pilgrims turning back now as the fleeing women gave them the word. I heard cries echo off the stone face of the mountain. I heard the men dying down there, as she, unseen, struck them with that power, that great seductive and easy power, and the women stammering madly of miracles and visions, and then the wind rose, swallowing everything, it seemed. The great indifferent wind. I saw her shimmering face for an instant. She came towards me. I thought, this is death again. This is death coming. The woods and the wolves coming and no place to hide, and then my eyes closed. When I awoke, I was in a small house. I didn't know how we'd gotten here, or how long ago the slaughter in the mountains had been. I'd been drowning in the voices, and now and then a dream had come to me. A terrible yet familiar dream. I had seen two red-headed women in this dream. They knelt beside an altar where a body lay waiting for them to perform some ritual, some crucial ritual, and I'd been struggling desperately to understand the dream's content, for it seemed that everything depended upon it. I must not forget it again. But now all that faded. The voices, the unwelcome images, the moment pressed in. The place where I lay was dark and dirty and full of foul smells. In little dwellings all around us, mortals lived in misery, babies crying in hunger, amid the smell of cooking fires and rancid grease. There was war in this place, true war, not the debacle of the mountainside, but old-fashioned 20th century war. From the minds of the afflicted I caught it in vivid glimpses, an endless existence of butchery and menace, buses burned, people trapped inside, beating upon the locked windows, trucks exploding, women and children running from machine gun fire. I lay on the floor as if someone had flung me there. And Akasha stood in the doorway, her cloak wrapped tightly around her, even to her eyes as she peered out into the dark. When I had climbed to my feet and come up beside her, I saw a mud alley full of puddles and other small dwellings, some with roofs of tin and others with roofs of sagging newspaper. Against the filthy walls men slept, wrapped from head to toe as if in shrouds, but they were not dead, and the rats they sought to avoid knew it, and the rats nibbled at the wrappings, and the men twitched and jerked in their sleep. It was hot here, and the warmth cooked the stenches of the place, urine, feces, the vomit of dying children. I could even smell the hunger of the children as they cried in spasms. I could smell the deep, dank sea smell of the gutters and the cesspools. This was no village. It was a place of hovels and shacks, of hopelessness. Dead bodies lay between the dwellings. Disease was rampant, and the old and the sick sat silent in the dark, dreaming of nothing, or of death perhaps, which was nothing, as the babies cried. Down the alley there came now a tottering child with a swollen belly, screaming as it rubbed with a small fist its swollen eye. It seemed not to see us in the darkness. From door to door it went crying, its smooth brown skin glistening in the dim flicker of the cooking fires as it moved away. "Where are we?" I asked her. Astonished, I saw her turn and lift her hand tenderly to stroke my hair and my face. Relief washed through me, but the raw suffering of this place was too great for that relief to matter. So she had not destroyed me. She had brought me to hell. What was the purpose? All around me I felt the misery, the despair. What could alter the suffering of these abject people? "My poor warrior," she said. Her eyes were full of blood tears. "Don't you know where we are?" I didn't answer. She sat close to my ear. "Shall I recite the poetry of names?" she asked. "Calcutta, if you wish, or Ethiopia, or the streets of Bombay. These poor souls could be the peasants of Sri Lanka, of Pakistan, of Nicaragua, of El Salvador. It does not matter what it is, it matters how much there is of it, that all around the oasis of your shining western cities it exists. It is 3/4 of the world. Open your ears, my darling. Listen to their prayers. Listen to the silence of those who've learned to pray for nothing has always been their portion. Whatever the name of their nation, their city, their tribe." We walked out together into the mud street, past piles of dung and filthy puddles, and the starving dogs that came forth and the rats that darted across our path. Then we came to the ruins of an ancient palace. Reptiles slithered among the stones. The blackness swarmed with gnats. Derelicts slept in a long row beside a running gutter. Beyond, in the swamp, bodies rotten. Far away on the highway, the trucks passed, sending their rumble through the stifling heat like thunder. The misery of the place was like a gas, poisoning me. As I stood there, this was the ragged edge of the savage garden of the world in which hope could not flower. This was a sewer. "But what can we do?" I whispered. "Why have we come here?" Again I was distracted by her beauty, the look of compassion that suddenly infected her and made me want to weep. "We can reclaim the world," she said, "as I've told you. We can make the myths real, and the time will come when this will be a myth that humans ever knew such them to solve. Surely, it isn't only their obligation, it's their right. How can we aid in such a thing? How can our interference not lead to catastrophe?" "We shall see that it does not," she said calmly. "Ah, but you don't begin to comprehend. You don't realize the strength we now possess. Nothing can stop us, but you must watch now. You are not ready, and I would not push you again. When you kill again for me, you must have perfect faith and perfect conviction. Be assured that I love you, and I know that a heart can't be educated in the space of a night, but learn from what you see and hear." She went back out in the street. For one moment she was merely a frail figure, moving through the shadows. Then suddenly I could hear beings roused in the tiny hovels all around us, and I saw the women and children emerge. Around me the sleeping forms began to stir. I shrank back into the dark. I was trembling. I wanted desperately to do something, to beg her to have patience. But again that sense of peace descended, that spell of perfect happiness, and I was traveling back through the years to the little French church of my childhood as the hymns began. Through my tears I saw the shining altar. I saw the icon of the Virgin, a gleaming square of gold above the flowers. I heard the Aves whispered as if they were a charm. Under the arches of Notre Dame de Paris I heard the priests singing, "Salve Regina." Her voice came, clear, inescapable, as it had been before, as if it were inside my brain. Surely the mortals heard it with the same irresistible power. The command itself was without words, and the essence was beyond dispute, that a new order was to begin. A new world in which the abused and injured would know peace and justice finally. The women and the children were exhorted to rise, and to slay all males within this village, all males save one. And 100 should be killed, and all male babies save one, and 100 should also be slaughtered immediately. Peace on earth would follow once this had been done. Far and wide there would be no more war. There would be food and plenty. I was unable to move, or to voice my terror. In panic I heard the frenzied cries of the women around me. The sleeping derelicts rose from their wrappings only to be driven back against the walls, dying as I had seen the men die in Azim's temple. The street rang with cries and clouded flashes. I saw people running. I saw the men rushing out of the houses only to drop in the mud. On the distant road the trucks went up in flames, wheels screeching as the drivers lost control. Metal was hurled against metal. Gas tanks exploded. The night was full of magnificent light. Rushing from house to house, the women surrounded the men and beat them with any weapon they could find. Had the village of shanties and hovels ever known such vitality? As it did now in the name of death. And she, the Queen of Heaven, had risen and was hovering above the tin rooftops, a stark, delicate figure burning against the clouds as if made of white flame. I closed my eyes and turned towards the wall, fingers clutching at the crumbling rock. To think that we were solid as this, she and I. Yet not of it, no, never of it. And we did not belong here. We had no right. But even as I wept, I felt the soft embrace of the spell again, the sweet, drowsy sensation of being surrounded by flowers, of slow music with its inevitable and enthralling rhythm. I felt the warm air as it passed into my lungs. I felt the old stone tiles beneath my feet. Soft green hills stretched out before me in hallucinatory perfection. A world without war or deprivation in which women roam free and unafraid. Women who even under provocation would shrink from the common violence that lurks in the heart of every man. Against my will I lingered in this new world, ignoring the thud of bodies hitting the wet earth, and the final curses and cries of those who were being killed. In great dreamy flashes I saw whole cities transformed. I saw streets without fear of the predatory and the senselessly destructive, streets in which beings move without urgency or desperation. Houses were no longer fortresses, gardens no longer needed their walls. "Oh, Marius, help me," I whispered, even as the sun poured down on the tree-lined pathways and endless green fields. "Please, please help me." And then another vision shocked me, crowding out the spell. I saw fields again, but there was no sunlight. This was a real place somewhere. And I was looking through the eyes of someone or something walking in a straight line with strong strides at incredible speed. But who was this someone? What was this being's destination? Now this vision was being sent. It was powerful, refusing to be ignored. But why? It was gone as quickly as it had come. I was back in the crumbling palace arcade among the scattered dead, staring through the open archway at the rushing figures, hearing the high-pitched cries of victory and jubilation. "Come out, my warrior, where they can see you. Come to me." She stood before me with her arms extended. God, what did they think they were seeing? For a moment I didn't move. Then I went towards her, stunned and compliant, feeling the eyes of the women, their worshipful gaze. They fell down on their knees as she and I came together. I felt her hand close too tightly. I felt my heart thudding. "Akasha, this is a lie, a terrible lie, and the evil sown here will flourish for a century." Suddenly the world tilted. We weren't standing on the ground anymore. She had me in her embrace, and we were rising over the tin roofs, and the women below were bowing and waving their arms and touching their foreheads to the mud. "Behold the miracle! Behold the mother! Behold the mother and her angel!" Then in an instant the village was a tiny scattering of silver roofs. Far below us, all that misery alchemized into images, and we were traveling once again on the wind. I glanced back, trying in vain to recognize the specific location. The dark swamps, the lights of the nearby city, the thin strip of road where the overturned trucks still burned. But she was right. It really didn't matter. Whatever was going to happen had now begun, and I did not know what could possibly stop it.